Hi, so in this video we're looking at landscape and resources. So we'll start off with the River Nile. So the River Nile really was the roadway of ancient Egypt, and it ran from the south to the north. But the source of the River Nile came from two different places. One of the sources, which is the White Nile, this water comes from the Great Lakes of Central Africa, and this was Egypt's freshwater supply all year round. The other source of the River Nile was the Blue Nile, and the Blue Nile water came from the Ethiopian mountains. Now this was very important for the ancient Egyptians, because at the beginning of June, the snow and ice started melting on these mountains, and it would run down into the Blue Nile, bringing this rich, fertile soil from the mountains. Now, when we talk about an inundation, we're talking about a flood, a massive flood. So it's down here, where it first comes into Egypt, 10 meters of extra water. Up here in Lower Egypt, 4 meters of extra water. So anything that came with it got swept along in this big flood. Now the flood started in Egypt around June, and by the end of August the country was flooded. Eventually, when the flood waters drained back through the Nile system, the Egyptians were left with two thick piles of black mud either side. And remember, this mud, this fertile soil, came from the Ethiopian mountains. Without this soil, they could not grow their food in Egypt, and there would not have been an ancient Egyptian civilization as prosperous and as successful as it was. It would have been reduced to living in Lower Egypt, where there is fertile soils. So this great flood, bringing this lovely fertile soil, enabled the Egyptians to grow food. The two main crops was wheat and barley. Now, the wheat contained yeast and the barley contained sugar. We don't know who, it's lost in time, but someone came up with the idea that if you heat it up, if you put the wheat into a pot of water and you heated up the barley and you put that in the pot, then the sugar in the barley would react with the yeast in the wheat, starting a fermentation process, producing beer. And beer was the staple for everyone in ancient Egypt. Even with the king's lists of food requirements for the afterlife, the top of their list is bread and beer. So from wheat they made bread, and with the bread and the barley they made their beer. Everyone started drinking the beer from the age of 2. So they regarded it as a foodstuff. And it did obviously contain alcohol which was cleaning the insides of their bodies, keeping out infection. So the Upper Egyptians are mainly engaged in farming. So obviously the river is running from the upper lands into the lower lands, which is why it's called Upper Egypt. So I'll just pop that up there for you, Upper Egypt. And it's running from south to north, one of the very few rivers that does run from south to north. Now, if you can imagine, in Lower Egypt here, originally there were 7 canals filtering out the water into the Mediterranean Sea up here. Only 2 survive today, only 2 branches. The other 5 have been silted up. So we've got lots of marshlands here where the river is draining out into the Mediterranean Sea. Lots of grasslands up here. This is where the Egyptians fed their cattle. This is where the papyrus reeds grow as well. Now they could make lots of different products from papyrus reeds. They could make boats and baskets and shoes and paper. And paper was a great trade product for the ancient Egyptians. They traded their paper all over the Mediterranean world. A really good, cheap writing surface, which was light to transport on boat across the Mediterranean Sea. Another plant which was grown was called flax, and from flax you could make a yarn to produce linen. Linen vital for light clothing in a hot country. So we have all these resources here. They did have a little bit of tin, which ran out very early on in their history. They had some copper, which again they ran out of it. They mined it away very quickly, and they relied on Cyprus, the islands of Cyprus, for copper. They had a little bit of silver, which again they exhausted very early in their civilization, and they looked to the ancient Greeks as a source for silver. But they had lots of gold, which they found in what the Romans described as Nubia, beyond their borders. They saw that wherever this river ran was their kingdom. So wherever the river Nile ran, even to modern day Sudan, they claimed those lands for themselves, and that's where most of the gold deposits were. The upper Nile is surrounded by lots of cliffs, where they could get their sandstone for building pyramids and tombs. Again, in Lower Egypt, there's lots of outcrops of rock, sandstone outcrops for building pyramids. Deposits of other expensive stones like quartzite, yellow and orange, where the river had ran a course, changed its course millions of years ago, and created these very highly unusual rocks of yellow and gold. Deposits of basalt, which came out of volcanic eruptions millions and billions of years ago. They had that, as well as red quartzite, green quartzite. Turquoise they got from Sinai, which was over here. And of course other trade products, which silver that I mentioned came from the Greeks, and tin, which the Phoenicians brought to them to create their Bronze Age, actually came from Cornwall, our country in the UK. So those are the resources of the ancient Egyptians. 70% of the population was engaged in either farming or animal husbandry. The other 30% are engaged in making linen or products out of papyrus reeds, or fishing, that sort of thing. So those are the landscape and resources of the ancient Egyptians. Another key comment here is that they called their country Kemet. Kemet, which means the Black Lands. They identified that this soil that came into their country was their life force. Without that fresh black soil every year, they could not grow their food, and without food you could not live. So they associated the colour black not being a negative colour like it is in the West, but being a positive colour. To them, the colour black meant life, and that's why they called their country Kemet. Now, later on in their history, when the Greeks ruled this land, they changed the name from Kemet to Egyptus, which is where you get the modern name Egypt from. But the people who lived in this landscape before they were conquered by the Greeks called themselves Remet, Kemet, the people of the Black Lands. Another foreign name that was used was from the Hebrews over here in Palestine, modern day Israel. They called the leaders of Egypt pharaohs, which means great house. But that's not what these people called their leaders. They called their leaders the Neb-Tawi, His Majesty the Neb-Tawi. And the Neb-Tawi means the Lord of two lands, the Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt. So these are the basics that you should really know if you are hoping to understand about the ancient Egyptians. Well, that's my first lecture on the landscape on resources. I hope it was informative and you learned something new which you didn't know before. And I look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now.